Relay connection established. Archive access granted. Origin unknown. Verification impossible. Proceeding with recovered transmission. Designation, ninth relay.
Most people think outbreaks begin with a warning. A hospital notices something strange. A laboratory finds a pathogen. Someone sounds an alarm, and the rest of us rush in to figure out what happened. That is how it is supposed to work. My name is Dr. Elena Marlow, and I spent 16 years investigating infectious diseases for state and federal agencies. I thought I understood how outbreaks spread, how they were contained, and how easily fear could make people see patterns that were not really there. Then in the spring of 2026, I was assigned to a cluster of gastrointestinal illnesses that had appeared in several states. At first, there was nothing about it that seemed unusual. By the time I understood what we were actually tracking, the outbreak had already reached places none of us had sent it, and the people responsible for stopping it were no longer trying to stop it. The first warning came through the usual channels. A cluster of gastrointestinal illnesses had been reported in 3 states, then 6, then 11. By the time I was assigned to the investigation, the number of confirmed cases had passed 800 and was still climbing. The symptoms were unpleasant but not immediately alarming. Severe cramping, prolonged diarrhea, dehydration, and fatigue. Most patients recovered within a week or 2. A few required hospitalization. 2 elderly patients died, though both had underlying conditions, and no one was prepared to say the infection had killed them directly. At first, we assumed it was foodborne contamination. The case interviews suggested fresh produce, but nothing lined up cleanly. Some patients had eaten bagged salad. Others had eaten restaurant salsa. A few had consumed berries, herbs, or vegetables from entirely different stores. There was no single brand, distributor, or product that connected them all. I had worked enough outbreaks to know that patterns rarely announce themselves politely. You had to pull them from the noise. For the first 4 days, I barely left the conference room. We scanned receipts, traced suppliers, and plotted shipping routes across maps that covered nearly an entire wall. Every time we thought we had found the common ingredient, another case broke the theory apart. Then I noticed the farms. They were different farms, producing different crops and selling through different distributors, but nearly all of them sat within the same agricultural basin in the central United States. The basin covered hundreds of square miles, which was still too large to mean much by itself. Then I overlaid the irrigation records. Most of the farms had recently begun drawing water from deeper wells. Years of drought and increased agricultural demand had lowered the shallower groundwater levels, forcing producers to drill farther beneath the surface. Some of those wells reached more than 1,000 feet. I remember staring at the map for several minutes before calling the Regional Water Authority. By the end of the day, field teams were collecting samples. The first laboratory results arrived 48 hours later. There was something in the water. Under a microscope, it looked vaguely like a parasite egg, though none of our parasitologists could identify it. The shell was translucent, nearly spherical, and far smaller than most known intestinal parasites. Chemical staining produced inconsistent results. Attempts at culturing failed. The strangest result came from sequencing. Every sample appeared genetically identical. Not similar, identical. Samples recovered from patients in Texas matched those found in produce from Kansas. Samples collected from irrigation wells matched material taken from a hospitalized patient hundreds of miles away. There was almost no genetic variation. I asked our laboratory director if that was unusual. He looked at me through the observation window and said that for something reproducing across that much distance, it was impossible. His name was Dr. Thomas Vale. Thomas had been with the agency for nearly 25 years. He was respected, patient, and irritatingly calm during emergencies. He had taught me years earlier during my fellowship, and had personally requested that I join the investigation. I trusted him. That is important to understand. When I suggested shutting down the affected wells, Thomas approved the recommendation immediately. At the time, I considered that proof that he took the threat as seriously as I did. Looking back, I understand why he wanted those wells closed before anyone else did. Within 72 hours, federal and state agencies issued recalls covering several produce suppliers. News networks picked up the story. For 3 days, the outbreak dominated national coverage. Then the story disappeared. Not gradually, completely. I noticed it while drinking coffee in the hotel lobby before sunrise. I searched for our public advisory because I wanted to see whether the latest case numbers had been added. The page returned an error. I checked the archived press releases. Nothing. I searched the major news sites. The articles were still there, but several had been updated overnight. The language had changed. Officials had determined that the reported illnesses were unrelated. Preliminary laboratory findings had failed to establish a common source. No evidence supported claims of widespread contamination. I read those statements twice, then a third time. I had seen the evidence. I had held the reports in my hands. I opened my laptop and accessed the internal case database. The outbreak classification had been changed from active multistate investigation to closed, unrelated cases. I immediately called Thomas. He answered on the second ring. I asked if he had seen the website. He said he had. I told him they had closed the investigation. He said he knew. When I asked why, there was a pause before he told me to come into the office. I drove to the regional command center expecting confusion. Instead, I found people packing boxes. Maps had been removed from the walls. Sample logs were being archived. Temporary staff were being reassigned. It looked like the end of an investigation that had been running for months instead of one that had been declared an emergency less than a week earlier. I cornered one of the microbiologists near the elevators and asked what had happened. She frowned at me and asked what I meant. I asked about the water samples. She asked what water samples. I thought I had misheard her. I clarified that I meant the deep well samples and the organisms we had found inside them. She stared at me and said she had never tested anything like that. I reminded her that she had been in the lab when we opened them. She told me she had not. I remember the way she looked at me. She was not nervous. She was not avoiding eye contact. There was no hesitation in her answer. If she had been lying, she was better at it than anyone I had ever met. I went back to my office and found the original sequencing report on my laptop. The file was still there, but the digital signature attached to it had changed. The author was listed as Dr. Elena Marlow. Me. I had not written it. That evening, I copied every file I still possessed onto an external drive. Then I stopped trusting the system. For the next week, I conducted my own investigation. I called hospitals directly. I contacted county health departments, using personal numbers. I asked pharmacists about unusually high sales of antidiarrheal medications. I contacted patients whose names had disappeared from the federal database. The outbreak had not ended. Cases were still appearing. Someone was simply removing them. I expected to uncover bureaucratic panic, political pressure, maybe fear of economic damage. Food recalls cost enormous amounts of money. Farms were being shut down. Distributors were losing contracts. There were plenty of perfectly ordinary reasons someone might want the problem to disappear. Instead, I found Thomas. Travel records showed that he had visited the affected farming basin 3 weeks before the first official cases were reported. He had never mentioned it. I requested his itinerary through an old contact in procurement. The trip was listed as an investigation into bacterial contamination at a private well. I called the county clinic nearest the farm. The receptionist initially refused to discuss patient records. I gave her my federal credentials. There was a long silence before she told me he had been sick. I asked who she meant. She said Dr. Vale. My grip tightened around the phone. I asked when. She told me March 17th. Severe dehydration, fever, gastrointestinal symptoms. I asked how long he had been hospitalized. One night. I asked whether a diagnosis had been recorded. No. I asked what happened after. She told me he discharged himself the next morning. I hung up knowing Thomas had been infected before any of us knew there was an outbreak. I spent the next 2 days reconstructing everything he had done afterward. Thomas had approved nearly every major decision. He had authorized expanded testing. He had recommended deeper sampling. He had moved teams between states. He had arranged for specimens to be transported to multiple federal laboratories. He had personally encouraged me to travel. At first, it looked like incompetence. Then it looked like sabotage. Finally, it looked deliberate. I broke into his office just after midnight. I am not particularly proud of that part, but by then I was not interested in following procedure. I found nothing unusual in his desk, and nothing in the filing cabinets. His computer required biometric authentication. I was about to leave when I noticed the water bottle beside his keyboard. It was half full. I stared at it for a few seconds. Then I took it. The laboratory I used was not affiliated with the investigation. It belonged to a university researcher I had known for years, who owed me a favor, and more importantly, did not ask many questions. The sample tested positive. Thomas was still carrying the organism. I returned to the command center the following evening. I found him alone in the dark conference room, where our outbreak maps had once hung. He did not look surprised when I walked in. He told me I had tested the bottle. I asked how he knew. He looked toward the empty wall and said, because he would have done the same thing. I told him he knew what was happening. He said yes. I told him he had been infected before the investigation started. He said yes again. I asked if he had changed the records. He admitted that he had changed some of them. I asked if he had shut down the warning. Again, he said yes. I stepped closer and asked him why. Thomas turned toward me. He looked exhausted, not frightened, not angry, just tired. He told me he was not helping it spread. I asked what he was doing. He said he was helping us survive it. I almost laughed. I told him people were sick. He said most recovered. I told him people had died. He said people died from influenza. I told him that was not an answer. He said no, it was perspective. Then he told me what happened after he became sick. At first, there had only been fever. Then the dream started. He dreamed of darkness beneath enormous weight. He dreamed of pressure so great that a human body would have been crushed instantly. He dreamed of water moving through cracks in stone. Sometimes he dreamed he was watching the surface from somewhere far below it. Other times he felt as though the surface was watching him. The dreams continued after the fever disappeared. Then memories came with them. Not his memories. Places he had never visited. People he had never met. A farmhouse destroyed by fire. A stone well in a field. A boy drinking from a wooden bucket. A woman coughing beside a river. Different eras. Different countries. Always water. Always sickness. I told him he was describing hallucinations. He said he thought so too. I asked what had changed his mind. Thomas reached beneath the table and slid a folder toward me. Inside were photocopies of old medical reports. The first was dated 1907 and described an outbreak of severe gastrointestinal illness in the same agricultural basin. The next was from 1841. Then, there were handwritten journal entries from settlers in the late 18th century. I read the passages. The symptoms were nearly identical. Cramping, dehydration, persistent thirst. Then I found a line underlined in red. Wells throughout the county had reported unusually high water levels despite drought. I looked up and asked if the wells had actually risen. Thomas said every time. I told him that was impossible. He agreed. Then he opened another folder containing modern geological surveys, aquifer measurements, and maps. He told me the organism was not coming from the farms. I asked where it was coming from. He pointed toward the floor. I shook my head and asked if he was saying it was underground. He said the things we were finding were not independent organisms. I asked what they were. He said he did not know. I asked why he was protecting them, if he did not even know what they were. Thomas leaned back and told me it was because they had tried killing them. He explained that they had sterilized one of the first wells before the recall was announced, using chlorine, heat, and chemical treatment. 2 hours later, there had been a microseismic event beneath the farm. I told him it could have been coincidence. He told me they had tried again. Then he slid another report toward me. There had been a cluster of small earthquakes, then another. Springs had appeared miles from the original site. Groundwater pressure had begun rising. He told me they stopped after that. I felt a chill run through me. I asked if he thought something had reacted. He said he knew something had reacted. I reminded him that he did not know that. He agreed. I asked why he would cover everything up based on a guess. Thomas looked at me for a long moment and said, because whatever was down there had survived beneath us longer than our species had existed. I asked if he thought keeping people infected would stop it. He said he thought exposure was part of the process. I asked what process. He hesitated before saying he did not know. That frightened me more than anything else he had said. I repeated that he did not know. He said no. I told him he was helping it anyway. His expression tightened. He asked if I thought he had not asked himself the same question. I told him he was infected. He said yes. I told him it had changed him. He said probably. I asked if he trusted what it showed him. He said no. That answer caught me off guard. Thomas leaned forward and said that was the problem. For the first time that night, he looked afraid. He told me he did not trust it at all. But every time they resisted, something worse happened. I thought about the rising wells, the earthquakes, and the springs. I asked what it wanted. Thomas looked toward the floor and said he did not think it wanted anything. I asked what he meant. He looked back at me and said he thought it was waking up. I left with the files. By morning, I had copied everything. Laboratory reports, suppressed case numbers, Thomas's travel history, internal emails, geological surveys. I contacted a journalist in Washington I had worked with years earlier, and we arranged a secure transfer. At 2:13 that afternoon, the story went live. Within minutes, social media exploded. National networks began calling the agency. Screenshots spread faster than anyone could delete them. For 23 minutes, I thought I had won. Then the article disappeared. The journalist's profile vanished. The news network replaced its breaking news banner with a weather report. I called him. He answered and asked who I was. I told him it was Elena. There was silence. He asked Elena who. I reminded him that we had spoken that morning. He said he did not think so. I said the outbreak. He asked what outbreak. I hung up. That was when I finally understood that Thomas was not working alone. I returned to the university laboratory. I had saved blood samples from several investigators. Thomas tested positive. So did the regional director, the laboratory administrator, 2 epidemiologists, 3 logistics coordinators, 1 communications officer. All positive. I stared at the results for a long time before testing myself. Negative. I cannot adequately describe the relief I felt when I saw that result. I almost collapsed. For several minutes, I simply sat there breathing. Then I remembered something. During the first week of the investigation, we had collected baseline blood samples from everyone handling the unknown organism. My original sample would still be stored. I found it in the freezer. March 29th. I ran the test. Positive. I checked the label, then checked it again. I tested the sample a second time. Positive. I tested my current blood again. Negative. I sat there staring at those results because I could not make them fit together. The organism had been inside me, and then it had left. I had never been sick. No fever. No cramps. No dreams. Nothing. I began reviewing my travel records. Kansas, Missouri, Colorado, Illinois, Georgia, Maryland. Every facility I had visited. Every laboratory where I had transported samples. Every university specialist I had consulted. Every freezer where specimens had been stored. A map slowly formed on my screen. 6 laboratories, 3 universities, 2 government research centers, 1 hospital. I stared at the routes. I had thought Thomas was sabotaging my investigation, but he had approved every trip, every sample shipment, every consultation. Then my phone rang. Thomas Vale, I answered. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I told him he had known. I could hear him breathing quietly on the other end. I told him he had sent me. He said yes. I told him he had used me. He said he did not know whether it would work. I asked what he meant. He told me the organisms did not stay in everyone. I stared at the map and asked what that meant. Thomas said they thought some people were carriers. I told him I had never been sick. He said he knew. I asked if he had known I was infected. He said not at first. I asked when he knew. He said after Colorado. I felt sick. I told him he could have stopped me. He said no. I asked why. Thomas was silent for a few seconds before saying it was because I was doing exactly what it needed. I closed my eyes. A notification appeared on my screen. A county health department in Maryland had reported 37 unexplained gastrointestinal cases. Then another alert appeared. Illinois. Then Georgia. All of them were near laboratories I had visited. I reminded Thomas that he had said he was trying to stop it. He told me he had said he was trying to keep us alive. I asked what the difference was. He did not answer. Another notification appeared. Then another. I watched new markers spread across the map and asked what happened now. Thomas was silent for so long that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Now we find out whether I was right." That was when I heard the dripping. I turned toward the laboratory sink. A single drop of water struck the basin, then another. I walked toward it. The water coming from the faucet was slightly cloudy. I said Thomas's name. He answered. I asked why the water was cloudy. He did not answer. Somewhere beneath the building, the pipes began to groan inside the walls. I looked down at the floor. For just a moment I thought I felt something move beneath me. It was not an earthquake. I have experienced earthquakes. This was slower, heavier, like something impossibly large shifting its weight far beneath the ground. My phone crackled. Then Thomas whispered, "It's closer than I thought." The line went dead.
Transmission complete. Archive updated. Relay connection terminated. Signal lost.